Okay, it's time for a couple more stories here. This first one is kind of a cool little story about this. When I was back in the late 70s, when I was living down in southeast Texas, I used to hang out at Sambo's, and I got to know everybody over there. There was a lot of people that came to the coffee shop that I hung out with, and some of them were postal carriers, and some of them were just people from various walks of life. And I got to know some of the people that worked at the restaurant, like the manager, some of the waitresses and all. And one of the waitresses was telling me that she said something about she didn't have anything to drive. She wasn't but about 17. I says, well, why don't you have anything to drive? She says, well, the motor on my car burned up. And I said, what'd you do? Let it run out of oil or water or something? She says, no, the engine caught fire and burned up. And I said, well, what are y'all doing about that? What kind of car is it? She said, it's a 63 Buick Special. And she said it's a car that my folks have given me for Christmas. They gave me an ignition coil and a distributor cap and some spark plug wires. But the rest of the stuff is burned up on the engine too. And I said, well, I might be able to take a look at that, you know. And she was, you know, you could tell she was up for whatever I could do to fix it. So I went over there, and the wire, I mean, the whole top of the engine had caught fire, and you know, destroyed the wire harness. And so I took the wire harness and unplugged it from everywhere it was plugged into, which it wasn't a complicated wire harness on a 63 Buick. And I laid it out on the tailgate of my pickup, and I really didn't put a whole lot of time into it. I used butt connectors and a roll of wire. I had one wire at the time. That's how you do that, you know, because I didn't know enough to rebuild a wire harness without hooking it up. You know, I'd start from this one and go to that one, you know, separate the wire and do that. Anyway, I put it together and taped it all up, and put her distributor cap and her plug wires on it, her coil and all that stuff, and fired the car up, and it ran really good. And so she said, how much do I owe you? I said, oh, $25, I guess. And so she paid me, well, she was a waitress, and she got paid in change. She paid me with rolls of quarters and whatnot. And when I went to cash them in, and she was the one that was cashing them in for me, she wanted me to put my name and address on there so that if there was washers or something in there, you know, they could. And she was the one that rolled the quarter. Anyway, that's a funny little thing. But that was something that happened a long time ago. That's what that thing looked like back in those days. You might notice how Buick enjoyed putting the distributor up in the front, and you know, the oil pump was down there at the bottom too. That was something Buick did for years, was laying that distributor in there at an angle like that. And of course there's your wiper motor and your blower motor and that kind of thing. These cars were very, very simple. There wasn't a whole lot to them. And there's your stoplight switch right there. You know, where it's got a little pressure switch with them little wires on it. And every time when you had brake pressure, to turn on your stoplights and all. Those cars were kind of fun. Well, this right here is a Jeep Commander that we worked on over at the college when I was over there. Customer said it overheated a couple of times. It was misfiring on cylinder number 8. And our job was to determine why it was misfiring on cylinder number 8. That was pretty important. And so the Jeep wasn't a head gasket problem. It had thrown a rocker roller on cylinder 8 for some reason. We pulled the spark plug out. It didn't look like it had any coolant getting in there or nothing. But we had to remove the AC lines and stuff to get that valve cover off. And we did the refrigerant identification. We went up with 94% R134 and 5.5% hydrocarbons. That's really important. This is the thing. I preach this all the time. If you pull that trash into your recycle machine, now some of the recycle machines now, the really nice ones, have got an identifier on them. But if you pull that trash into your recycle machine, then you're going to be disseminating it to all the other cars that you work on. And that is not a good thing for anybody. Now, granted, a refrigerant identifier is pretty pricey, but if you care about your customers and the cars you're working on, you won't just pull any kind of gas that's in a strange car you're working on, store it in your machine, contaminate that, and contaminate all the other. It spreads around like coronavirus, you know. All right, so the Jeep coolant leak that was making it overheat, we saw, you know, these chalky coolant stains on the bottom of this pipe here. So, well, it's coming from somewhere up there above that. Notice that this hose clamp was out of place. And I said, well, maybe that's got something to do with the leak, because that's right above where the coolant's leaking. But it wasn't leaking there, oddly enough. You know, that hose that got vulcanated to the heater core pipe. But that was something we had to fix as a part of the deal, but that wasn't where the coolant leak was. The coolant leak was coming from this sorry plastic T that somebody had put in there. You know, the original T they put in there had failed, and so somebody went and just found a plastic T somewhere. I don't know where they bought it. I don't know if they got it at Walmart. It probably was never even intended to carry hot coolant, but they had put that in there, and that was a real problem because you can see where it's cracked right there. We got one that was a lot better. If I'm not mistaken, we may have put one in there that was aluminum or something, but I don't remember. One way or another, we got that straightened out. Now this Toyota Tundra hunting truck was pulling out of his driveway and it stalled. He didn't know what was going on. We pulled the fuel pump out of the tank because he had no fuel pump operation and no fuel pressure. And I found that whoever it was that had put a fuel pump in there, and we didn't do it, had tied these wires together in a kind of a crummy way or used butt connectors on them, and they had come loose. And so basically we had to dry all that off really good and solder those wires and then put some shrink tubing on it. Of course, you got to be careful not to set fire to anything while you're doing it because the pump's still wet. You know, you can dry it off though, so you don't have issues with that. So anyway, that's what we had to do to fix that one. Something else we used to see on some of the old Jeeps, Cherokees, is we would see a loss of fuel pressure when you shut it down. You know, it's supposed to hold good steady fuel pressure when you got it after you shut it off, because if you don't, you'll have hard starting problems. And we'd see them leaking down because these clamps would get loose in the inside the tank. Now that was on a Jeep Cherokee. That's a long time ago. I hadn't seen that on hardly any other vehicle, but we saw that on quite a few Jeeps when I was at the dealership. I don't know if they just didn't tighten them enough in the factory or whatever. On the Silverado, we had an oil leak, and I got to put some dye in there and turned on our black light and saw this coming from here. This, you know, kind of an unusual thing. Got to looking at where it was coming out around the oil filler cap. I said, okay, that's interesting too. The oil filler cap had a good gasket on it, but it was coming out around there anyway. And it turned out the PCV part of that valve cover was clogged up. The PCV system wasn't working right. Some of you guys may be familiar with that. You're supposed to replace that valve cover when you got problems with the PCV. And there's also a baffle in the replacement valve cover. A lot of aftermarket suppliers make those valve covers. That wasn't a very difficult fix there, but that right there is supposed to act as the PCV system. You remember how some of these Asian vehicles, in lieu of a PCV system, and even on some of your Jeep 4-liter Jeeps, they didn't have a PCV valve per se. Back there in the rear valve cover grommet on those Jeeps, they would just have a little, they'd have a vacuum feed going back there and have a little grommet. In the grommet they'd have a little L fitting that had a little hole that was between a 1/16 and an 1/8 of an inch or something. And that doggone thing was clogged up with crud, and your PCV system would, you know, stop working, and it would cause oil to go into the breather and all that nonsense. Well, some of the Asian cars just basically had a little orifice in the valve cover, and they had a vacuum line going over there to pull air out of there. They didn't actually have a PCV valve either. And this one here was kind of moving in that direction. But I thought it was kind of silly that they made the valve cover. You see that oil puddle up in there? They made the valve cover with the PCV orifice in it, so you'd have to replace the whole valve cover if you had issues with the PCV valve. Now this one right here was a simple tire rotation. You ever get a job that you feel like it's just going to be a slam dunk, push pull, slam? You know, when you say, okay, well, it's going to do rotate the tires on this one. Well, it turns out that some yo-yo had either overdone it with an impact wrench several times on those lugs and started stretching the threads, and then they gall when you're trying to take them off, and then the teeth get wiped off of this in the hub while you're trying to spin it out of there. And the tire is dancing around on there so that you can't get it off, and it just gets better and better. There's not a good way to take care of this problem that I've found, other than the fact that we got a big old pry bar and put pressure on the wheel right there at the place where that lug nut was, and kept working with it till we either twist off the lug or it screws off of there. This one here had been cross-threaded at some point, and then they just rammed it right on there. One time I stopped to help a girl changed a tire beside the road over here on the bypass, and her dad came not long after I got there, and we had a 4-way lug wrench, and one of the lugs on that Altima were so doggone tight, and her dad was a big man. I had him pushing down on one side of the T-handle lug wrench, and I was pulling up on the other side. He was giving it everything he had, and I was giving it everything I had, and we almost didn't get that lug nut broke loose. All the rest of them you could break loose. That one there was an absolute disaster. But anyway, why it is, it's always a good idea to use torque sticks, or I always taught my students to use a torque wrench, because you're just going bang, 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 bang. We, my wife always liked to get, when she was driving the Explorer I'm driving now, she liked to get the maintenance work done at the Ford place on that. And one day we headed out for Mississippi on that thing after she had the oil changed and the tires rotated, and because it was under warranty, she felt like she needed to get it done there, and that's fine with me, Anyway, long and short of it was, we lost a lug nut, and I found 2 other loose ones when we were on our way back. I mean, I've seen them, you hear the lug nut come off and it bounces under the car. You get to look and you've lost the lug nut. I checked the torque on all the rest of them, and somebody had just made a single pass on all the lug nuts in a big hurry, without even checking to make sure they were okay, and that was just downright silly. Now, something else that will happen, there was one that I may have talked about in one of these other videos. This guy had a Jeep Cherokee, or Grand Cherokee, that he said the left front wheel, the lug nuts kept coming loose on it, and he really didn't know what to do about it. And I don't even know what the backstory was on that, but he had sent this to me in one of my emails. And I told him, I says, what you need to do is make sure that you that you got the right lug nuts. I said, what you can do is you can take one lug nut from your other 3 wheels, remember which ones they are, put them on there, torque them like they're supposed to be, because he was torquing with a torque wrench and everything, they were still coming loose. And when he did that, they didn't come loose anymore. And so his problem was the bevel neck on his lug nuts was the wrong angle. And if you've got aftermarket wheels and you use the original lug nut, sometimes you'll have a situation where the wheels will come off, because the lug nuts will work loose, because the taper on the lug nut is different from the one on the wheel, and it just enables it to work loose. Anyway, that took care of his problem. He put a whole new set of lug nuts on there so they never came loose again. Nobody's fault on this Ranger here. This Ranger right here was a vehicle that only had 35 miles on it when I got it from Ford Motor Company in 1998. It's a 98 model Ranger, but I got it in 2001 because it had been underwater and they couldn't sell it to anybody. And so I asked for some trainer vehicles. They motor convoyed this one down here on a truck, and had 35 miles on it. The speedometer didn't work as far as the needle, but the odometer worked. So, and it was a nice little truck, had a 3-liter engine in it, and I used it for years and years for training and all that. Well, the last year that I taught over there, there was an exercise that one of the dual enrollment students was doing where they had to pull the power steering rack off of it and put it back on. So he pulled the rack off, he put it back on, he tightened the lines, made sure it didn't leak, he made sure it was full of power steering fluid. He did everything just exactly like he was supposed to. He ran it for a while, bleeding the air out of the steering and all that. And then he parked that thing out there, and he went to wash his hands, and somebody noticed smoke coming from under the hood, and the alternator had caught fire on this thing after he parked it and did a massive burn job under the hood. Of course, by this time the thing had been used for nearly 20 years for a trainer truck, and I think they eventually got rid of it. But that was a crying shame. I couldn't really fault him for the fire starting here when he had been working underneath the truck. Nobody's fault, total surprise. And this one here is a lady that was in my program. She brought me these 2 spark plugs, and she said these came out of my brother's Ranger, and it was one of those that has a dual plug, with the the Rangers with the 2 coil packs, the 4-cylinder Rangers with 2 coil packs and 8 spark plugs. And what a lot of people don't know is when you're starting those up, they're starting on the plugs that are on the passenger side of the engine, and the ones on the driver's side don't start firing until the engine starts running. That is a strategy called dual plug inhibit when you're starting a truck. Now, I don't know why Ford did that, but that's what they did. I was working at Ford place, and those trucks were brand new. Anyway, I had seen this kind of thing before. She said we put 2 brand new plugs in here, and within a very short period of time, they look just like these. Okay, I'll let you think about that a little bit. What do you think would cause plugs to burn out like this? This is horrible. It looks like you got a torch on them. All right, and then you put 2 brand new plugs in it, and the brand new plugs do this same thing really quick. And I saw this on an F-150 at the Ford dealership when I was working over there. a guy that was working in the next service bay. Um, he was a guy that was a pretty good mechanic, and he found one skipping on cylinder number 5 on an F-150 with a 5.8 in it, I think. And so he had a plug that was burned out the same way. It looked like somebody literally put a torch on it until it was red hot and just burned it up. And so he looked at that plug and said, gosh, I've never seen that before. So he put another plug in it, and it went out of there running just fine, but it came back a couple of days later skipping, and that brand new plug was destroyed the same way. And so after that, he went to checking the compression, and all of the cylinders on that engine had 175 pounds, but the cylinder that was misfiring had 120. And it basically had a leaking intake valve that was pulling air in there and making a super lean condition. It was super hot. And so they pulled the heads off that thing, got a valve job done. Well, the only thing that happened with that was that cylinder had been running super hot. Because of that, it was still skipping on that same cylinder because the injector was clogged up because the injector got too hot. And so I wound up cleaning the injectors on it, and I cleared it up for the skip had to be cleared up even after the problem that caused the burning up plugs, it's still skipping on that cylinder. That kind of confused the shop for me. But once we cleaned the injectors, it came about. I told this girl here, I said, what you've got is you've got a problem I expect with leaking intake valve. It's letting some air in there, and it's making it run too hot in that cylinder. And she said they did a valve job on it, and it took care of this problem. Starter replaced at another shop, alternator not charging the battery. This is the actual picture of the car that happened on. And so they brought it from another department over there where they'd been tinkering with it. And what we found when we went under there is this wire that's supposed to, a lot of these car companies and OEM manufacturers, they like to use the starter post for a junction point. And it is a good one because it's a good solid one. It's good. You got a good tight nut on there, all that copper. Well, these folks right here, notice which post, this is the post that's actually got the strap going into the starter. This one never gets hot and is never connected to the battery unless you're turning the starter to the start position. So this wire right here should have been connected to the post that was on the other side. You can't see the post it was supposed to be connected to. That's what was wrong with that. Wasn't too hard to figure it out. It went to the hot terminal on the alternator. There wasn't no power there. So tracked it back down to where it was supposed to go, and there it was. One time I was on a trip to Texas with my mother. I was thinking about this fusible link right here. That's what I was trying to say a while ago. And sometimes that fusible link, well, actually not that one, but the one that goes to the trigger wire. See that purple wire there that energizes the solenoid? I was driving down the road, heard some rattling noises coming from under the car, and I looked in the rearview mirror and I saw pieces of black stuff on the road behind me. Next thing you know, the battery light comes on, or the alternator light. It said 72 Chevy Impala, and this was in 78, so the car wasn't about 5-6 years old. So anyway, I pulled over and I opened the hood. Sure enough, the belts were coming all to pieces. I said, good grief, we got a mess here. So I had some extra belts in the trunk because anybody with any sense when there was V-belts typically had some extra belts in the trunk and some tools to change them with, so I changed out the belts. We were about a mile outside of Muleshoe, Texas, if you know where that is, me and my mother. We were going to the Grand Canyon. And so I changed out the belts, got back in the car, turned the key, and I had nothing. I said, well, I wonder what that's about. I wonder if it's killed the battery because it was driving with the alternator belt slipping. This doesn't make any sense. And so I took off beating the pavement running while she sat there to read the book with the windows down in the car. And somebody gave me a ride into town, and I went to a gas station where this guy was in there with some coveralls on. And I says, I got a breakdown out here. I need a jump, So the guy put me in this old Thunderbird he had, and some jumper cables, and we headed out over there, and we went where the car was, hooked the jumper cables up, and still had nothing. And I said, well, that's ridiculous. And so I reached under the car, how you reach in there behind the wheel under there where the starter, and I felt of those wires. And I used my pocket knife to short between the battery terminal and the solenoid wire, and I started the car that way. And I said, that fusible link going to that starter solenoid is open, because I had seen that before, but I didn't expect it on this one because I hadn't any trouble before it threw those belts. What did those two things have to do with one another? Well, try to explain that to a customer, Because when you work on something, sometimes you caused a problem. There's other times you didn't cause a problem, but because it wasn't doing it before you worked on it, they just swear you caused the problem. Well, I knew doing doggone well that I didn't cause that problem. But I still had it, and I didn't want to jack the thing up with a bumper jack and roll under there on a, lay it on my back and let the car fall on me. And so I just gave this guy $5 and sent him on his way. And we drove over there. Seemed like it was right close to the Texas-New Mexico state line. We stopped at a gas station. There was a guy with a big afro and had, pretty blue eyes. And he was a gas station guy. Raised it up on the left. He replaced that fusible link for me and only charged me $3. I didn't expect to get it fixed that cheap, but never had any more trouble with the car after that. Anyway, seeing that fusible link reminded me of that story. Now this one here was a frozen Fusion AG. I'm going to go into this one telling you that because she kept wanting the car back at the end of every day, I had no idea at the end of this thing what was causing this, even though I did a lot of stuff to try to fix it. Alright. You notice this right here was freezing up, and when it froze up, she'd stop getting airflow. That was the right here what I was reading coming out of the register, and this is what the evaporator temperature was reading on the IDS. And so initially we changed out the evap temp sensor, which those die all the time, but they don't usually die in such a way to make it freeze up. Alright, replaced the pressure switch. That wasn't any good. Did research. A lot of dealers having the same problem. This is the pressure switch we replaced. And I called, and this one guy that I didn't call, but I called a guy I knew that worked at the dealer, and he had one he was fighting with. He couldn't figure out either. And I looked online. There was a forum, and this guy said he had one of these, that he took it to a dealer in Georgia, and they kept it 2 weeks, never figured it out, gave it back to him unfixed. He took it down to Florida because he had to go down there for something anyway. Took it to a dealer down there. They kept it for 2 weeks. It was freezing up just like this, Ford Fusion. They couldn't figure it out. I did something kind of radical. I even temporarily moved got another evap temp sensor, which they don't cost much. And I actually put it in the register where this reading was coming from. I said, if I move that evaporator temperature sensor to the register, then maybe it will read what this thermometer is reading. I had to pull the wires up there and connect them and all that. And did you know that thing still froze up and read wrong? And I had put a controller on it too. And that was just really a bumfuddle to me because I never had time to keep the car long enough to figure it out and fix it. She kept having to take it at the end of every day. That's basically the way it is whenever somebody comes in the morning and they want to drive the car home in the evening. We really never had the time to devote to it. But it was an incredibly interesting situation. Some of you guys may know what causes this or what it takes to fix it. Drop me a line if you know. Catalyst destroyed this Altima engine. You know how these catalysts come apart and the EGR cycles that crud back up through there, or it rattles up in there because of exhaust pulses. Pieces of rock gets up in there and gets on top. Anyway, this thing came in knocking. Now, if it just came in knocking and we threw another engine in it without checking the catalyst, shame on us because it's going to ruin engine number 2. But we knew these things tended to do that. Some of your old SHO Ford Tauruses had a tendency to ingest some chunks of stuff from the catalytic converter too. This particular one got enough of the stuff in there and messed it up. Well, the guy that put the motor in was a pretty good mechanic, but he missed something. And what he missed was, you see those 2 little ground wires right there? Somehow or another, they were down out of the way where he couldn't see them. He didn't think about hooking them up. If those 2 ground wires aren't hooked up on an Altima, it ain't going to start. So he had left these swinging. That's where they went, and that's what they look like when they're hooked up. That was a fairly easy fix, but he learned something, and I guess I did too at that particular point. That's the end of the slideshow. I just wanted to tell you some stories today. I hope you weren't too bored with it. And I'll be in touch and try to have you something else next Monday. Until then.